Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kenya. I thought I would try something a little bit different today, sitting in a chair. Usually I sit on the floor because that's just easier, but I remembered that I had this director's chair that my mom and my sister gave me, God, years ago. It's just been sitting and collecting dust in the living room and it really needs to be cleaned off, but I figured I would try it and see if I like kind of the angle and stuff. So if you have opinions about that, feel free to tell me. So today is, oh poop, the 23rd, I think, of December. Yes, 23rd, because tomorrow is Christmas Eve. So today is December 23rd. I'm going to go through the Read Harder Challenge prompts for 2020, see what I've read, and see if I think I can still make the challenge for the year. Okay, for anyone who doesn't know, the Read Harder Challenge is put out by Book Riot every year. And I actually have a local group, we're not all local anymore, of women who get together once a month to talk about the different prompts for the challenge. So it's 24 prompts and you can double dip. We've been meeting, I think, 3 years. I think this is our 3rd year, I think. And there are a couple of times when one or more of us have actually read all of the 24 prompts, but I think mostly we don't. By December, we kind of go through, look and see which books we've already read, meet some of the prompts, and then we pretty much decide whether or not we're going to try and finish it or not. So for 2020, Sarah Says Read, she has read 6 books that count for the prompt just by browsing or have reads for 2020. So she's kind of decided, nah, I'm not going to try and do this for this year because there's only like 10 days left or whatever. 7 days left. I don't know. Not a lot of days left. But in other years, like if she were at like 23, then she probably would just read the last one. And then Lauren, who is at Books and Bites, she wasn't at our last meeting, so I'm not sure how far she's gotten. And then there are a couple of folks in the group who are more casual readers, so they don't have like social media devoted to reading and stuff. So I say all that to say, let's look at the prompts from 2020. So the way that usually we do this, so Sarah from Sarah Says Read and I usually meet at the very end of the year and split the categories up by month so that there are 2 per month. And then the whole group kind of talks about those 2 prompts every month. Even if, I mean, we could read it anytime during the year because the challenge is an annual challenge. For January of 2020, the categories were read a debut novel by a queer author and read a food book about a cuisine you've never tried before. So I've done both of those. For a debut novel by a queer author, I'm going to use Here Comes the Sun by Nicole Dennis Benn. I've talked about that in another video. And I'm going to use Buttermilk Graffiti for my food book about a cuisine I've never tried. So Buttermilk Graffiti was actually a pretty interesting book. It talked a lot about how the food immigrated with people over to the US and how it's kind of changed as it's become more Americanized. So I believe I read it via audiobook in maybe January or February. I really enjoyed it, although 2 people I know who have attempted to read it really found the author a little bit obnoxious, but I liked it. For February, we read a book about a natural disaster and read a romance starring a single parent. So for the single parent, I read The Governess Game, which I talked about before. I loved it. It was a romance about a woman who goes to be the governess of a duke or something like that. And he is raising 2 children who are actually not his biological children, but they come with the title, whatever his title is. And they're really interesting kids, and it's a great story. Loved it, loved it. I think it was Tessa Dare. And then I'm going to use Severance for the book about a natural disaster. That was a natural disaster that ended up being, it was actually a post-apocalyptic post-apocalyptic book. So it might be a little bit of a cheat because it is a little bit of a cheat, but I feel okay about that. For March, it was read a retelling of a classic of the canon, fairy tale, or myth by an author of color, and read a book that takes place in a rural setting. So Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, totally took care of that one. Although I've got a number, retellings are kind of my jam, so I've got a number of those that would count for 2020. But I'll use Tristan Strong for that one. I'm really looking forward to the second one. That one's based on African American, and Black myth and fable. So loved it. And then Lost in the Spanish Quarter by Heidi Goodrich. I know, will count for my takes place in a rural setting. So in that book, I believe that the main character, she might be American, and studying abroad in Spain, and falls in love at least once, and kind of goes around to her friends' different countrysides from where they were born and where their parents live and all those kinds of things. So I'm going to use that for rural setting. April, read an audiobook of poetry and a doorstopper. So a book over 500 pages, published after 1950, written by a woman. So I'm going to use Legend Born for that one by Tracy Dion. So Legend Born was actually the book that I read in either October, November must have been. That was my have Twitter pick your book from my TBR cards. And it was over 500 pages, so it counts for that. It was great. Love it. You've heard me talk about it. Read that book. It was probably one of my top picks for the year. And then I read Bone by Yrsa Daley Ward for the poetry and loved that. Well, I liked it. I'm not really into poetry. I read it via audiobook, just like the prompt says, and that usually makes poetry and verse a little bit easier for me to get into. Okay, May, read a book about climate change. Haven't done that one. I could still conceivably read a book about climate change, which was actually a prompt for my December TBR cards, you may recall, that I still haven't read. If I go to the library and get like a children's book or something very short that's factual about climate change, I could still make that challenge prompt happen for this year. Read a middle grade book that doesn't take place in the US or the UK. So I've got two books that could fit this category. One is Before We Were Free by, I believe, Julia Alvarez, that takes place in the Dominican Republic, or The Jumbies, which I just read a few weeks ago, which takes place in the Caribbean. And I liked both of those books. The Jumbies being magical. Of course, I liked it a little bit more because I'm into that whole fantasy thing, but I liked both of those. June, read a historical fiction novel not set in World War II. So I could use Before We Were Free for that one as well, if I want to double dip, or if I use The Jumbies for that other category. The one I have written down is The Home for Unwanted Girls. So that takes place in Canada, I believe, and follows two main characters, a woman who starts off as a girl in an orphanage, I believe, in Canada, and then the baby that she ends up, the baby that she bears that also ends up, I believe, in an orphanage or foster care. So that was The Home for Unwanted Girls. And then the other category for June was read an edition of a literary magazine, digital or physical. Haven't read a literary magazine, I don't think, this year. I need to double check because I did help edit a literary magazine, but I think it was the end of 2019. And the magazine that I contribute to, I'm pretty sure doesn't count as a literary magazine. I'm not sure what a literary magazine is now that I think about it. Maybe it does count. If so, I've done that one. If not, I need to find a literary magazine. For July, read a YA nonfiction book. I don't think I've read any YA nonfiction in the history of the world, so I'd have to figure that out. Ideas, drop them below. Read a sci-fi fantasy novella under 120 pages. The one I was thinking was going to count ended up being 136 pages. That was The Haunting of Tramcar 015, which I really enjoyed and would recommend if you're into fantasy and Cairo. August, read a memoir by someone from a religious tradition or lack of religion that is not your own, and read a play by an author of color or a queer author. So a local playwright, director, guy named J. Smyer Crosby wrote a play called Sharks, and I sat in on the table read for that, so I'm going to count that for that category. And When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. I'm probably saying his name wrong. It was his memoir. He's was an American neurosurgeon who during residency found out that he had lung cancer. And he wrote a book, partially, I think, kind of to process his own kind of experience, but also to bring some compassion to working with patients, I think. The book was published posthumously. The book was published posthumously and has an afterword by his wife, who is also a physician. And it was a beautiful book. And he's a Christian guy, and I am not a Christian guy. So I'm going to count that. For September, read a book with a main character or protagonist with a disability, fiction or non. I'm going to use The Storm Runner by J.C. Cervantes, but I don't remember what the disability was. It might have been ADHD, but I'm not totally sure. Read a book by or about a refugee. I think I have a number of books that would count for that category. I'm going to use The Grief Keeper. And that book was about a teenager and her young sister who are fleeing Argentina, I think, or Colombia, to the U.S. And she agrees to be part of an American experiment so that she doesn't get sent back. October, read a mystery where the victim is not a woman. I'm going to use Double Indemnity by James Cain. The audience knows who the killer is and what's going on, but the people in the book don't, so I'm going to count that as my mystery. And read a horror book published by an indie press. I read Horror Store, which is about a haunted IKEA-like store, I believe in Canada. I could be making that up. All of the countries that I mentioned here, I could be totally making up. I don't have a mind for those kinds of details. November, read a picture book with a human main character from a marginalized community. I'm going to use Solway by Lupita Nyong'o. I read that way a long time ago during a second Sunday story time over at the Avenue Black Box Theater as a community reader. And I love that book. I love the pictures in that book, and the kids loved it. So that's the book for that. And read a book in any genre by Native, First Nations, or Indigenous author. I'm going to use There for that book by Tommy Orange. And that book is about a group of Native, I think they're teens. They might be young adult, like early 20s, who are trying to go to a powwow or a concert. I don't remember exactly, but it's been a while, but I really enjoyed that book too. I think I enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to. I don't think I had a good idea about what that book was about before I actually read it. December, read a graphic memoir. I'm going to use Good Talk by Mira Jacobs. Love her. She's a sweetheart. And read the last book in a series. Over the summer, I read a number of quick romance series, and I'm going to use Heart of the Devil by Megan March for that category. So if everything stands the way I have it written here, I need to read a book about climate change. I need to read an edition of a literary magazine. I need to read a YA nonfiction book, and I need to read a sci-fi fantasy novella. I don't think I own any of those 4 things, which is probably why I haven't read them. So I'll have to buckle down over the next week and see if I want to try and finish those. I'm not sure. This might be another one of those years where I'm just a few away from the very end, which is okay, because really part of the reason why we get together is because we like to get together and talk about books. Not that anybody feels a really strong pressure to finish the challenge. Book Riot did put out their 2021 prompts. So again, there's 24 of them. A couple of the ones that I'm looking forward to: read a book featuring a beloved pet where the pet doesn't die. If you've got an idea about that one, drop it below. One that I think is hard, but a good category: read a children's book that centers a disabled character but not their disability. Read a fat positive romance. And one of the ones that I put in February for 2021: read a book you've been intimidated to read. I have no idea what I'm going to read for that category. All right, so that's the Read Harder Challenge. Have you ever done it? Have you ever finished it successfully? I think 2020 is my fourth year. And there's only been 1 year that I've read all of the categories. And I always read enough books. I just don't always read them in the categories that they suggest. So for example, I am 4 categories short of this 24 category challenge, but I've read 122 books. So if I'd been more like mindful, I could have done this and been done with it way earlier. But some books I just don't like to read, even if there's a challenge involved, like a book about climate change. Gross. All right. I will see you on the next one.